Okay, we're very honored to have Professor Jan Schwarz, who's associate professor from Lund University. He holds the Yiddish chair at the university since the year 2000, since the year 2010?
11.
Since the year 2011. He's the author of two important works, one on Yiddish autobiographies, and his most recent one on Yiddish culture after the Holocaust. And he comes to Austin not infrequently to work on the Isaac Bashevis Singer archives. And I think we could say he is actually the expert on the archives, which is at the Harry Ransom Center. And he's going to inform us on what Yiddish life is like in Sweden and how it got there. Thank you, Professor Schwarz.
Could I get some water?
Water.
Yeah.
Water?
Yeah, water, just a glass of water.
How about apple juice? Oh yeah, there's water, okay.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me, Tatjana and Itzik. This is, I feel this is my fourth visit to Austin. And usually when I come to Austin, thank you, I go to the Harry Ransom Center and look at the Isaac Bashevis Singer papers. And so this is the first time I'm actually presenting something at the university, which is a great pleasure. And I'm going to tell you about a very interesting corner of the Jewish world in Scandinavia that you probably don't know that much about, and particularly about how Yiddish became an official minority language in Sweden, of all places. And I'm going to present the paper here, read it to you, and show you some examples of Yiddish culture in Sweden. And then after that, you feel free to ask questions. I understand we have an hour for this? Yeah? To 2 o'clock, yeah. So I will just start here and try to keep the time. That's always the challenge.
We got kicked out at 2, so.
Yeah, so, and I'm glad that you're enjoying your lunch. You just, es Gesundheit, as we say, eating good health. So I'm going to start with a quote from a very, very thick report that was just published last year about minority languages in Sweden. And when they, this is part of the Swedish system, they write these very thorough reports and 500-600 pages long. And these are committees that basically, their reports are used by policymakers to make decisions about funding and the way the policies are going to be shaped in the future. So let me start with this quote from the report. So in 1999, the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, recognized 5 national minorities: Jews, Roma, Sami, Swedish Finns, and Tornedalians. I'm going to get back to that. By ratifying the Council of Europe's European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages and the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, Sweden has committed itself under international law to protecting the national minorities and supporting their languages and cultures. This is belated recognition not only of Swedish national minorities, Jews, Roma, Sami, Swedish Finns, and Tornedalians, I'm going to return to that, and their languages, but also of the common Swedish cultural heritage. The Swedish government emphasized that this was a recognition for groups who had been both marginalized and oppressed for large parts of Swedish history, unquote. Okay, so what this tells us is that in this report from last year, stating that 20 years ago, Sweden adopted a new minority policy by ratifying an EU convention. And that is very important because, as you'll see from this presentation, Sweden would never have done this if it had not been for the European Union. And I'm going to return to that. So as a result of that, Sweden is obligated to protect its 5 national minority languages. And this is viewed as a part of Swedish cultural heritage. Moreover, since the 1980s, the Council of Europe has begun to integrate minority rights as part of the Human Rights Charter of the United Nations and the European Union. So this act, the Swedish Act on National Minorities, went into force on January 1st, 2010, and makes 5 languages official minority languages, and they are Finnish, the biggest one, Yiddish, the smallest one, Meänkieli, which is a dialect of Finnish, which is spoken in this Tornedal. It's a valley bordering between Sweden and Finland. Romani Chip, which is a European language, and there are different dialects of that. And the indigenous population, the Sami population, their various dialects. Similar to Swedish, these 5 minority languages should be used, developed, and learned through the agency of the public sector. So we are in a socialist country. No, we're not. But compared to America, this sounds very socialist. Of course, everything is done through the public sector, funding from the public sector. That's how these countries in Northern and Western Europe operate, right? So the problem here is that all this sounds really good on paper, but how is that being implemented? Not very well. There's been a lot of criticism for lack of funding, and there's been the historically strong pressure for minority to assimilate into Swedish society and give up their languages and culture has resulted in a decrease in the number of speakers of minority languages. And this applied to all the 5, even the biggest one, the Finnish. The goal of this report is for the Swedish educational system to create a, quote, an unbroken linguistic and educational chain to be established from preschool through to university, unquote. The key word is language revitalization in the public sector's educational system. That's the only educational system. You don't have private universities or schools. You have very few private schools, actually. It's 95% public sector funded schools. The conclusion of the report paints a dark picture of the situation for the national minority languages in the Swedish school system as a whole, and that applies to all forms and levels of education for all of the language. So, to give you an idea about what's actually happening on the ground now, the average teaching time in the public schools of minority languages is basically 40 minutes per week. And it's not very much. And in July of 2015, a new very interesting addition to the law was added, and that is that students without any prior knowledge of these languages, students who have some kind of heritage background, what we call heritage students, they can actually request or even require that their languages are being taught in the schools. So this has, of course, very wide-ranging consequences for the definition of, for example, what is Swedish culture? What is the Swedish literary canon? And one of my colleagues in Lund which I think is a little bit over the top. He has actually argued that great Yiddish writers like Isaac Bashevis Singer and Sutzkever, Abraham Sutzkever, should be included as part of the Scandinavian literary canon because they belong to an official minority language. So I just want to make a link between this situation, which is very, I know, I lived in America for over 20 years. I know this sounds very, very foreign to an American kind of mindset, right? But this is actually very similar to what happened in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, where you had a thriving educational and research institutions in various minority languages, the many minority languages that existed in the Soviet Union, including Yiddish. And of course, the difference between what happened in the Soviet Union and in Sweden today is that in the Soviet Union, this was part of the political and ideological control and propaganda via these minority languages of the communist ideology. That is, of course, not the case. In Sweden today, there's no ideological agenda here. It's a purely language issue of revitalization. So let's go into dig into the real numbers here, because I've already I'm still on with the okay. I've already gotten some questions about how many people live in Sweden and how many speak Yiddish, and now I'll show you this one here. So this is a chart. You can see the number of people who speak various languages in Sweden. There are different kind of. The one is according to the National Atlas, and the other one is an independent scholar. But you can see there are some differences. But more or less, it's the same pattern. So we're talking about a country of approximately 10 million people, the largest population the largest country in Scandinavia, and the majority are Swedish speakers as mother tongue. The second one is Finnish, and then you have a lot of other different languages, and all those other different languages like Arabic and Russian and German and so on and so forth, they are not considered minority languages in Sweden. Why not? Because the way the Swedish government wanted to create this minority policy was to let me just, before I go into that, let me just say that the only minority language on this list is Finnish, which historically has always been the largest one. Because of the proximity between Finland and Sweden, there's a huge Swedish minority group in Finland. There are actually parts of Finland where bilingual Swedish-Finnish, and that's the case is the same in Sweden. Finnish, Swedish. And then we have this area where there is a particular dialect of Finnish, Mienkele, which was also designated as an official minority language, and the estimated around 40,000 speakers of that. The Sami language is the third indigenous language, which has been spoken in Sweden for centuries. Also in various dialects, variants of this language, and it's very much related to the reindeer business and in the northern part of Sweden. And then you have a very large group of Romani chip speakers, and estimated around 50,000 in the whole country. And then we finally get to our topic of today, Yiddish. This is the anomaly, as usual, because estimated today there are probably less than 2,500 Yiddish speakers in the whole country, out of a Jewish population of approximately 20,000 people. So it's a very small group of people. And then you can add maybe 400 or 500 what we call heritage speakers. So the story of how, let me just tell you a little bit about the Jews of Sweden so you get a sense of where this is coming from. One of the requirements for the recognition of a language as a minority language was that it should have been used on Swedish territory continuously for 200 years. And it's very easy to document that when it comes to Finnish and to Sami and to the other. For Yiddish, it's more tricky. But, and this was one of the stumbling blocks, actually, because in the first round was when Yiddish was actually proposed to this governmental committee as a minority language, it was rejected. And then there was one or two people who were very fervent, and they actually did some thorough research and documented through archival work that Yiddish has actually been used as a language, spoken and written language on Swedish territory for these 200 years. Starting with the first Jew in Sweden, Aaron Isaac, who wrote his memoirs in a Western version of Yiddish in the, I think it was in the late 18th century. And it's actually translated into English if you want to read it. Very interesting book. And also it's been translated into modern Yiddish. And from then on, you have various waves of Yiddish-speaking immigrants coming to Sweden. The two main waves of Jewish immigration to Sweden was in the early 20th century from Eastern Europe. There was a group that came to the Scandinavian countries. Some of them wanted to go to America, but they didn't go that far. So they ended up in Sweden and Denmark. And the second one is after World War II. And that is where Sweden is different from the other Scandinavian countries. In Norway and in Denmark, there were no possibility of coming and immigrating after World War II. The borders were closed. In Sweden, on the other hand, there was a very clear policy to open borders and take in as many survivors and refugees as possible. And actually, at the peak in the late 40s, there were 30 or 35,000 survivors that came to Sweden. Only 4,000 or 5,000 of them stayed in Sweden. Most of them went on to other destinations. But those 4,000 or 5,000 were mostly, the majority of them were Yiddish speakers, and they came, I would say 80 or 90% of them came from Lodz, the Polish city, or from the vicinity of Lodz. And they're more or less a kind of a cohesive group of people, speak the same kind of Yiddish, the kind of Polish Lodzer Yiddish, and they settle in different small communities and used Yiddish in starting families, and there is an organic transmission of the language from that generation to the next generation. And that's why you see that today in Sweden, to my surprise when I moved there, you have relatively young people in their 60s, 70s that speak beautiful, fluent Yiddish with that particular Lodzer dialect. And this group, which is not, I mean, we're talking today maybe in the hundreds, right? They have been very, very outgoing. They're lobbied, and they have been very vocal in promoting Yiddish as an official minority language. And eventually they were successful. And as a result of that, what you see is various things that I'm going to introduce you to now. There was an establishment of a Yiddish academic chair in Lund University in 2011. They already started to teach Yiddish there in 2008, and I came in 11. And there's something that is important to bear in mind, which is very specific for Northern and Western Europe. And that is the whole thing about security issues. And this has a great impact also on the way languages are used. The thing is that most Jewish institutions are heavily guarded in Sweden, like they are in most other places in Europe. There is a low-level kind of anti-Semitism everywhere, and this also has a dual effect on people who want to speak Yiddish and kind of use that as part of their Jewish identity. On one hand, it kind of makes it dangerous to actually do it in public because it's recognizable to some people that it's foreign. It might even be, some people might even recognize it as Jewish, so it can be dangerous. Like wearing a kippah, that can be very dangerous also in public. But on the other hand, it has the reverse result, and that is people, they are seeking back to their roots and they're taking pride in their culture and their language. There's this kind of, it's kind of like an anti-assimilatory effect for some people in the Jewish community, which has been good for the renewal of Yiddish culture in Sweden. Let me just finish by saying a little bit about how it actually came about. Finally, at the end, how Yiddish actually, because as I told you, it was rejected in the first round. What happened was, and it's kind of like one of those twists of history. What happened was that the Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson, organized a Holocaust conference. And this was the first major Holocaust conference organized in Sweden, where it was very public. It was a political thing. He had invited the various representatives of political parties. It got a lot of press. And for the first time, it was kind of the whole issue about Sweden's role in the collaboration with Nazi Germany, and particularly with the very closed-door policy towards Jewish refugees in the interwar period that were basically sent back, and many of them perished. It was for the first time, it was on the table in a very public manner. And as a result of that, and this was, of course, picked up by the people who lobbied for Yiddish, and they used it very strategically. And I just want to give you an example of what happened at this point in history. It's a very unusual thing, because I don't think Yiddish would have been made the cut if it hadn't been for that Holocaust conference. So the president of the Yiddish Cultural Organization in Sweden, also a descendant of these Lodge Jews that settled there, she grew up in a small community, Borås, which is 100 kilometers west of Stockholm. And this is actually very interesting. It was like a Yiddish-speaking shtetl in Sweden in the 40s and 50s. And you had a community of Yiddish speakers there. And I know several of the people who grew up there. They speak beautiful Yiddish. And a very cohesive community. She grew up there, and feel very emotionally, very strongly about this. Is very important. It's a kind of the root of her Jewish identity. And she was part of the lobbying. I just want to quote a letter from, she wrote an article for a volume that I've edited about Yiddish culture after the Holocaust. And she said, and this is a letter to the Prime Minister of Sweden. This is not very Swedish, the way she approached this. This is very Yiddish, very interesting. Because in Sweden, people don't, they're very kind of, emotionally, it's very kind of reticent, right, to say the least. People are not very effusive. But this is exactly the opposite. Do not complete the work of the Nazis. Do not let the Minority Commission's exclusion of Yiddish give legitimacy to those who deny us our heritage and our culture. By denying the Yiddish speakers in Sweden our language, linguistic heritage and status, Sweden will be involved in history's greatest crimes against humanity 50 years after the Holocaust. Do not let this happen. And the Prime Minister did not let that happen. He signed and executed, basically he signed on the dotted line, and Yiddish became a minority language in Sweden. Okay, so let's just take a look at, I want to show you this. Yes. This is not historical. This is the last issue of the Jewish community journal that comes out 4 times a year. And it says Jiddische Krönika. In Swedish, it's supposed to be Judiska Krönika, Jewish Chronicle. But in this particular issue, was the focus on Yiddish. The whole issue was about Yiddish. Yiddish takes up a lot of space in the Jewish community in Sweden. Highly unusual. And especially for me, because let me just kind of reveal who I am. I'm not Swedish. I'm Danish. I'm Danish Jewish, right? So for me, this is a very foreign tribe, the Swedish people. And but this would never happen in Denmark. It would never happen in any European country that you would have the leading community center, community paper having an issue only about Yiddish and with Yiddish, kind of Jiddische Krönika. So, let me tell you a little bit about that, the internal politics. Of course, this is highly contentious in the Jewish community because, of course, I've focused on all the Yiddish speakers and the descendants of the Lotsche Jews and so on and so forth. But a good part of the Jewish community have no connection to Yiddish whatsoever. These are Jews who have lived in Sweden for generations. I mean, their origins are often Sephardic, and some of them are German background. They have no connection to Yiddish. And they feel that this is like, why use all these resources on Yiddish? We can use it on teaching a relevant language like Hebrew, for example. They feel that this is, so there has been this kind of internal conflict in the Jewish community about the relocation of these funds. But let me just tell you a little bit what has actually happened, which is very interesting. The Jewish day school in Stockholm, the Hillel School, opened in '53, and 95% of the students there were from Yiddish-speaking homes, or at least they had grandparents spoke Yiddish. But Yiddish was completely absent from the curriculum in this day school. And that continued until very recently. The focus of the day school in Stockholm, like in most other day schools in that part of Europe, was Israel and the teaching of modern Hebrew. That's the school I went to in Copenhagen. There was no Yiddish there. What's interesting about it is now, because of this whole governmental policy has completely changed the whole dynamic. And now there are suddenly funds available for hire of Yiddish teachers. Yiddish has become a visible language in Swedish society. You have radio and television programs in Yiddish about Yiddish topics. There's a certain visibility about Yiddish. Yiddish has become associated with Swedish Jews, which is highly unusual. And as a result of that, there is a kind of a new energy in Sweden in terms of passing on this heritage to younger people. There's actually some of the classes, Yiddish classes at these Jewish day school is full, 20, 25 students. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. Let me just show you, give you some examples of some of these activities that happens today. This is my favorite. I have many favorites, but this is a very nice one. So this is a student of mine who started when I came to Sweden 7 years ago. He was in the intermediate class and studying Yiddish. And now he is the publisher and writer of Yiddish children's books. He has a little publishing house in the town of Lund, where my university is located. And he has already published, it's amazing, he has published, I think, 7 or 8 books in Yiddish. And he told me that, and we can see them here. You have them here. This is called, his name is Olinansky, and we have Behälterlach mit Aleph und Beis. Yes, for children from 3 to 6 years old. Der Lunder Wunder, which is a new book. He wrote this book. It's about the wonder in Lund, 60-page long book for children in Yiddish. And he told me that he doesn't want to, his first books were bilingual, Yiddish-Swedish, but he doesn't want to do that anymore because he's going for the international market, right? So, and Swedish is not going to sell. So, and then he has die Fruchtene Yiddish Bichel für die Sami Jüngste. And der Chronik der Kosmonaut, die Anatomie mit Aleph Beis. And then this one here, which is actually by Kobi Weitzner, a Yiddish journalist who sadly enough passed away here recently. It's Der glückliche Mensch. Also, you can see here. So how is this possible? I mean, obviously this is not a big business in Sweden, obviously, right? There are not that many children that actually use these books. So how is this possible to publish all these books in 2 or 3 years? Because you can get meluche support. You can get funding from the government for these kind of things because it's an official minority language. So you can apply and you can get funding. So it's actually, that's the way it works. Let me show you another this one here. This one here, yeah. So we have in, I'll make it big so you can see it. Yeah. So these are various television programs about or in Yiddish And what I want to show you is this. I don't know if you're familiar with this. There's a, oh, no. Where is it? This, okay. There is a wonderful children's program called Alte Kartongen. And you'll get a kick out of this. We can start with this one here. This is a television program in Yiddish that was actually the format of these programs are the same, but they were actually done in all the 5 minority languages in the same way. And this is the Yiddish version of this. You can find them in Finnish and in Sami and in Romani, Chip, and so on. And this is the Yiddish version. And you can just get a sense of what it is. I don't know if there's sound on this, is there? Yeah.
Guten Morgen.
Gut ja. Hat noch nicht gezahlt das Dirigent.
Was meint ihr? Was ist dir Geld?
Die Krumm befindet sich in einem Haus. Und ich bin der Badebuster von dem Haus.
Oi.
Der bekommt mir Geld, ihr mit eurer Reutenkarre. Das heißt Dirigent.
Oi.
Die meiste ist, was ich habe nicht gesehen von euch, kein Dirigent schon ein hübsch bisschen jung.
Oi. Wen?
Lass mich hinterher. Bis dann muss ich kriegen das Geld. Kriege ich nicht das Geld, heißt ich schließen die Krumm und ihr werdet sich schon müssen rüberpeppen auf der Gast.
Hey.
Oh, seid nur kärntlich. Stellt euch vor, Tomme verpflanzt ihr eins von Otti kärntlich, wird er von einer rauswachsen, ein ganz gewichser Neis.
Jo, so ist das. Aber ihr tollt nicht schließen, unser Kram.
Ich werde zurückkommen morgen noch Mittag. Bis dann will ich kriegen das Geld.
Gut, sei gesund. Nein, was haben anzutan? Warum wollen wir nehmen das Geld? Es ist schrecklich. Sie will schließen unsere Kronreutinge. Was suchst du dort mit Blumenkastens? Was? Ist dir etwas eingefallen? Verpflanzen kärmlich. Was will herausgeben Blumen? Wir verkaufen die Blumen und mit dem Geld bezahlen wir bei der Boste. Ja, muss ich kurz proben.
Emmes hat ausgearbeitet, eine Kernblechmaschine.
Okay. Okay. So,
Alte Kartonen means old cartons.
yeah. Or because if you're interested in it, I can send you the link so you can send the link. You have the link, right? So if you're interested in looking at all these, there are a lot of these programs available here. They're wonderful, with a good sense of humor. And I also want to show you this one here because this is also, there's a radio program. It's called Yiddish für alle. This one here, if I can. Maybe. Yeah, there's a Yiddish radio program called Yiddish für alle with interviews with a lot of, in Yiddish, some of them, and some of them in English, and some of them in Swedish, with visitors to Sweden, Yiddish actors and musicians and scholars that come to visit. And you can find that also on the Swedish radio website. So it's also very rich. And it comes, I think, once or twice a month, there's a new program. And then there's this is one of the Yiddish performers in Sweden. and she's really made a name for herself as a performer. Her name is Louisa Line. I don't know if you probably know her, right? So I'll show you. And this is a very nice YouTube, very popular one of her most popular. You can see that. Okay. Okay. So, I think I'm not gonna. I think I've given you a little bit of taste. I can also tell you about what we do at my university, but this maybe is very similar to what you have here, in a different context maybe. But it's the classes, and I have seminars, and there's also a very active Yiddish Verband, Yiddish Forbund in Stockholm. They have a theater group. They have a new play every year in Yiddish, and they tour all over Sweden. They come to Malmö, to Göteborg, and perform Yiddish plays. There's a Yiddish choir in Stockholm. There's an annual seminar outside Stockholm with hundreds of people, totally in Yiddish, mostly in Yiddish. So it's a very interesting environment. There's a lot of things going on in this very small place, in a way, because of you have the protection of the government. So. I want to end here, and feel free.
Thank you, Jan.
Okay.
So if there are questions.
So your friend wants Isaac the singer to be a recognized author. What would be after that? Bagels at IKEA?
Bagels and IKEA.
Bagels at IKEA.
Bagels at IKEA, yeah. I mean, bagels, this is the thing about Sweden. You have bagels everywhere now. You can go everywhere and get bagels. It's become a standard thing. Yes. Yes?
So this Yiddish community, or Yiddish language speaking community, it's not really in your, in a traditional Jewish kind of religious setting, they look like they're from Brooklyn. So it's, you know, I mean, it's more westernized or modern, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And secondly,
Absolutely.
is what is the reaction to the, I mean, are there, like in other countries in Europe, are there a strong nationalist movement in Sweden, and what is their reaction to this?
I mean, it's a very good question. Well, it's complicated. You always use that word, complicated, but it is complicated. So, on one hand, okay, I'll tell you two things which actually surprised me. I've been in Sweden since 2011, and I teach Yiddish, and I'm very visible, and I have seminars, and I advertise them publicly on Facebook and so on and so forth. I've never had any problems with that. I mean, in terms of security and feeling unsafe. And then I had my seminar here in October, and I was suddenly called by the security at my university, and they said, "We have heard that there are some threats to the Jewish community in Lund, and we suggest that you have some guards there at your seminar." This is the first time. So at my seminar, there were 2 guards standing with protecting the thing. And it tells you a little bit about how things are shifting. And I'm not going to go into that. I can talk a lot about that. That's a whole. It's not about Yiddish as a minority language. It's about the condition of Jewish life now in Europe, which is and interestingly enough, there are 2 challenges right now for the Jewish communities in Northern and Western Europe primarily, and that is white supremacy, neo-Nazi groups are starting, and that's the one thing, and the other one is the whole Israel-Palestine issue that has some really negative impact, and especially in where I live in Malmö, there's a Chabad Orthodox rabbi he dressed very traditionally Jewish, and he's very visible as a Jew. He's been the target of a lot of abuse, and that is mostly from the Muslim, younger Muslim men, basically. So those are the 2 issues facing the Jewish community. But the good news is that the Swedish authorities, the police, take it very seriously. And they have allocated resources to protect the Jewish community. So it's perfectly safe to live there. I mean, there's been a lot of hype in some media about how unsafe it is to live as a Jew, particularly in Malmö. It's not true. I've lived there for 7 years. It's perfectly fine. But of course, I don't wear a kippah, and I don't. I mean, that's a whole different issue. If you do that, then you're much more exposed. Anyway, yes.
So it's interesting. I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
In some ways, it seems to me that as in the kind of 90s and 2000s, after World War II, there was a sort of a strong dominance of the Zionist narrative, right? Diaspora Jews, diaspora culture was kind of secondary to the revived Hebrew language, the state of Israel, and so on. Begins to shift in the 90s and early 2000s, where there's this embrace of diaspora Jewish culture, certainly in the scholarly community, that's true. But also, I think more as kind of multiculturalism becomes more accepted, it sort of becomes more accepted in the Jewish communities too, and it seems that the Swedish government has sort of inadvertently gone in and strengthened that party line, right? Like the diaspora kind of celebration versus the Hebrew language, the kind of state of Israel version. It seems to me that they've been strengthened by all this government funding. So it's interesting that they've kind of inserted themselves into this culture war inside the Jewish community, if you can call it that, by having the government funding available for Yiddish culture. Like they're giving that boost that they might not otherwise have had.
Yeah.
So the other thing is, how many people outside of the Jewish community learn Yiddish?
Well, that is a very good question. Because when I look at my students, many of them are not Jewish. And they are really interested in it, and they invest time and they learn it. They actually learn it on a very high level, some of them. And this is obviously it's not something that is useful in their daily life, right? It's not going to give them a better job or give them access to their family history or anything like that. But they just, they really kind of fall in love with the language. And I've seen that over and over again. Some of the kind of the most active young Yiddishists are not Jewish. I mean, she's not Jewish. And she's very, very out there as a Yiddish singer all over Sweden. So that is a very interesting phenomenon. And I can start to analyze that. And I think it goes, I mean, Yiddish is kind of like, it allows you to express things that you are not, that is more restricted in the Swedish society. Swedish society is a very inhibited society. I mean, don't take my word for it. I'm Danish. I have my prejudice. But Swedish, it gives you a license to kind of express things that you cannot necessarily do so well. And it's also so exotic for Swedish people. It's so different, right? This is something they learn about, a whole new culture that is so different from their own culture. So I also think that is part of it.
But is it a political position as well? Like embracing Yiddish in Poland is a political act,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Is it that in Sweden as well?
Yes, it is. It is a political act to a certain extent. And you can see that from that video, right? This goes back to, I think it's from Vilna, from the ghetto, Vilna ghetto, this song. It's kind of a resistance. We are here, and you will fight against our enemies, and you can't get rid of us. That's the gist. That is basically the gist of that song. And of course, this kind of, to maybe stretch it a little bit in answer to your question, there is this thing about Doigkeit. Wir sind do. I mean, Doigkeit is a concept in Jewish diasporism. We are here. This is where our lives are, and we're going to fight for our rights here and for our culture, and we're going to express ourselves in this place here. And that kind of Doigkeit, do means here, is I think is really appealing to certain segments of the Jewish population that are not necessarily see Israel as kind of the only way of identity, Jewish identity. So I think that is true, actually. So there's been kind of like this new revival of diasporism. But what's interesting, this is a Swedish phenomenon, and you see the same phenomenon in for example, in Germany and also in France, actually. But in other places you don't. I mean, in Denmark, which is the neighboring country, you don't have all this. This is totally foreign to Danish people and Danish Jews. They don't, I mean, there's no minority policy in Denmark. And there are very important minorities, historical minorities in Denmark. The Inuit people, they've been there for centuries, right? They don't have particular minority rights. They have their territory in Greenland, but not any minority rights in Denmark. And the same with the Romani Chib people in Denmark. They have no rights whatsoever. Their language is not protected in Denmark. So it's a whole different, the Danish model is much more kind of the nationalist model. There's one culture, there's one language. The Swedish model is trying, maybe not very successfully, but trying to create some kind of multicultural framework for this. And that's, you can see this as part of that expression of that kind of multicultural approach. And of course, it's not done, it's only done halfway. If they really wanted to do it, they could allocate more resources. They could really kind of promote it much more than they do. but they're at least doing something in Sweden about this. So, yes?
I was wondering if the neo-Nazism means that they also learn the German language, and in that case, between German and Yiddish, there might be some confusion.
I don't think that's,
No.
I mean, I wish they learned the German language, but
The neo-Nazis.
I don't know. I don't know anything about. So I can't say anything about that. I know that in Sweden, this new party in Sweden is called the Swedish Democrats that got 1/5 of the vote here in the last election, and which is basically a right-wing nationalist party. They have roots in the neo-Nazi, among neo-Nazi groups way back in the 80s and 90s. And that's why nobody wants in Sweden to work with them, because they have this bad reputation. But it's a huge problem with this kind of populism now. But that's a whole different topic for a different day, I guess. Any other final?
Does she write original lyrics as well?
Yes.
Does she always use, okay.
She does write original lyrics. She's very creative, and she also traditional songs and poetry, Yiddish poetry. She sets to music, and you can find a lot of her work also on YouTube. Her name is Louisa Line, Lyne. So you can go in and search her. Okay.
Any other questions?
Any other?
Thank you, Professor Schwarz.
Thanks.